1. The feral hostage-taker, my brother, Johnny, and I were spending some time at a remote cabin in northern Montana, nestled in a deep dip between towering mountains, tucked away amidst dense trees. We're both avid outdoorsmen, so this was a typical getaway for us. A few days of hiking, exploring, and just enjoying the deep woods. Our first day was relaxed. We were taking it easy around the cabin, still recovering from the long drive. It was around 5:30 p.m. when Johnny spontaneously decided to go for a quick walk before the light completely faded. I barely looked up from the couch near the fireplace, mumbling, "All right," as he walked out. He didn't take a backpack or any gear, so I knew he intended to be gone for just a short while. I settled back down, feeling the heavy exhaustion from driving most of the way earlier. The cabin grew darker and darker as the sun sank rapidly behind the mountains. It wasn't until the only light left inside was the warm glow of the fireplace that I realized Johnny hadn't returned. It was far too dark now to be walking around without a flashlight or headlamp. I sprang up, grabbing my day bag, a headlamp, and a powerful flashlight, and headed out to find him. My initial thought was pure primal fear. We were deep in bear country, and the possibility of Johnny having a dangerous encounter was high. But as I ventured deeper along the thin path, my fear subtly shifted. I was overcome by a growing sense of dread, making me repeatedly stop and glance behind me, half expecting to see someone following. I never saw anything, but the feeling persisted. After only 10 tense minutes down the trail, I saw Johnny emerging toward me. He looked deeply uneasy, not in a full sprint, but moving quickly, purposefully, like a person trying to put distance between themselves and something frightening. We both started speaking simultaneously. I was demanding to know what was wrong, and he was urgently telling me to turn back and hurry to the cabin. Eventually, we just fast-walked back together, making it inside where he finally explained what he'd seen. A man watching him from the trees. Johnny described the guy as having a profoundly creepy look, and as Johnny continued down the trail, the man appeared to be subtly stalking him. Johnny admitted that he intentionally waited until complete darkness to return, fearing the man would simply follow him back to the cabin if he came back in daylight. My older brother, trying to keep the mood light, assured me it was probably nothing, just some other distant cabin owner, and he was simply being safe. I wanted to trust him and dismiss the encounter as a fluke. We made dinner and then spent the rest of the evening outside on the front porch next to a crackling campfire. In truth, both of us were surreptitiously keeping watch, eyes constantly scanning the dark treeline, though neither of us admitted this silent agreement. The mountains grew quieter as the night wore on. We talked around the fire well into the night before heading inside to sleep until morning. After a quick breakfast, we packed our bags and set off on our main objective, a 6-hour hike up to the peak of one of the mountains. Afterward, we were both completely exhausted. The last hour of walking back to the cabin felt like it dragged on forever. Upon entering, Johnny tossed his pack down and announced he was heading straight for the shower. I collapsed onto the couch. The cabin was small, with only 2 rooms and 1 bathroom, so I had to wait my turn. I was lying there for maybe a minute when the memory of the strange man my brother described suddenly and forcefully re-entered my mind. I stood up and looked out the windows, an immediate cold expectation settling in. I almost expected to see the man right there. I walked back toward the couch, but a profound, overwhelming sense of wrongness washed over me. A few more minutes crawled by as I tried to pinpoint the source of my unease when I realized the shower's obnoxious water pump had not started yet. "Johnny!" No response. I got up and walked down the small hall toward the bedroom. I knocked on the door and called his name again. A paralyzing, deeply unsettling feeling gripped me as I reached for the handle and cracked open the door. I pushed the door open slowly, just a few inches. Through the narrow gap, I could see Johnny between the crack and the wall. He was kneeling on the floor in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and fixed on mine. He was subtly, desperately shaking his head no, clearly trying to warn me away. The pure, unfiltered terror in his eyes is still burned into my memory. A horrifying sight I pray I never have to witness again. Ignoring his plea, I pushed the door fully open, instantly seeing a man standing just a few feet from him. He, too, had wide eyes, but his were disturbed, tired, and unnerving. He wore tattered, disheveled clothes and had long, oily black hair. In that split second, there was no time for contemplation. It was a pure, instant, unprocessed reaction. I charged at him. It was only a couple of steps away that I saw him raise a gun from his side. I didn't hesitate, tackling him with full force. Johnny immediately reacted, knowing exactly what to do. We wrestled the firearm away from him and managed to pin him down. I swear, this man was completely feral, screaming, screeching, and clawing desperately to escape. I had never seen anything like the sheer wildness in his struggle. He wasn't letting up, so it took us a moment to formulate an escape plan. We decided that Johnny, being much larger and stronger, would hold him down while I got the car ready. I did as he said, quickly tossing our pre-packed bags, all ready from our hike, into the trunk. I started the engine and got the car idling. I returned to the cabin, and together we desperately tried to tie him up with anything we could find, just enough to buy us time to flee. We, of course, took the gun with us. We could hear the man's enraged screaming echoing from inside the cabin as we sped away. Once we reached a spot with cell service, we notified the police. But by the time the officers arrived at the cabin, the scraps of material we had used to bind him were scattered across the floor, and the man was nowhere to be found. My brother later explained that when he entered the room for his shower, the man had caught him completely off guard and held him at gunpoint, demanding that Johnny call me into the room. Johnny refused, knowing that would leave me defenseless, but then I walked in anyway. We still talk about how insane it was that I tackled a man with a gun. Honestly, I can't even explain the impulse. But it could very well have been the one thing that got us out of that cabin alive. Now, the only tangible clue the authorities have is the gun we handed over. They were able to trace the registration to a man who had been missing for 5 years, from an area about 50 miles away from our location. However, based on the description we gave of our attacker, the police concluded it was likely a different person. This leads us to the grim belief that whoever attacked us had also attacked the original owner of the firearm, ultimately leaving him as one more missing person case. Assuming things had gone any differently that afternoon, that could easily have been mine and Johnny's fate as well. 2. The unseen guest in 2016, I decided to make a pilgrimage to my late father's old cabin. It was a 6-hour drive deep into the woods, just outside the hometown he grew up in. That town was now nothing more than an abandoned, decaying row of old buildings and stores along a deserted road. My father rarely brought us to the cabin, saying there wasn't much reason once the town faded away. But after he passed, I felt compelled to visit the home he once built, hoping to do some restoration work to keep it standing and preserve it. More than anything, I hoped the trip would clear my mind, offering some much-needed peace and quiet. I drove there, arriving at the ghost town and parking my car discreetly behind one of the crumbling gas station buildings. From there, I hiked a thin, rugged, winding 2-mile trail up to the cabin. I carried all my backpacking gear and the necessary tools for the job. Part of me was ready to find the structure collapsed, prepared to camp in a tent if needed. Luckily, after the long trek, I found the cabin still standing in a small clearing. It was a simple, rectangular log cabin, its outer walls covered in creeping vines and greenery. When I walked in, I immediately noticed there were no locks on the door. The interior was in truly awful shape. Trash was scattered everywhere, and a damp, musty smell filled the air. It was clear that at some point, someone had realized the place was abandoned and had likely stayed there, perhaps for an extended period. However, the signs of occupation didn't seem recent, maybe a couple of years old. I moved what debris I could into a corner, creating a flat space for my gear. With the sun already setting, I unrolled my sleeping bag and settled in for the night. I should mention that although I didn't hear or see anything strange that night, I couldn't sleep for longer than 30 minutes at a stretch, waking up repeatedly with a strange, disturbing sense of unease. It made for a truly terrible night. I got up at sunrise, groggy and genuinely wondering if the whole trip was a mistake. I used my small camping stove to brew coffee, then took a walk through the woods to clear my head. It was still twilight, the sun only barely starting to peek through the canopy. A little ways in, I found a natural overlook, a small hill where I could see above the treeline. I thought it would be a perfect spot to watch the sunrise. But I found something else. From that distance, I could see the abandoned town. It was quite far, but I spotted a small light, clearly coming from a window in one of the old buildings. I couldn't tell if it was a house or a store. A minute later, it abruptly turned off. This instantly worried me about my car, but mostly, I was just surprised anyone else was out here. Probably just some urban explorers checking out the town. I rationalized, nothing to worry about. Still, it felt like an enormous coincidence. I sat on the hill for an hour, watching the sun rise, then walked back through the woods to finally start working on the cabin. My first goal was to clean and reseal the exterior walls. I must admit, the entire time I was working outside, that profound, uneasy feeling from the night before lingered. Every time I looked back at the woods, an eerie, formless sense of being watched loomed over me. It took a while to truly understand the feeling, but I finally grasped it. I felt like I was not alone. I kept working but constantly looked over my shoulder. The possibility of anyone else being out here felt genuinely remote. The abandoned town, sure, but here in some random woods with only a decaying cabin? I decided I must be anxious for reasons beyond my control. Once the sun began to set, I headed inside and tested the old wood stove. These things are seemingly indestructible. It fired up without a problem and quickly warmed the small cabin. I sat near it, watching the flames, listening to the comforting crackle, and contemplating everything. My dad, this trip, and life in general. Sometime later in the night, the crackle of the fire was suddenly joined by a similar sound. Distinct cracks and crunches coming from the front of the cabin. I turned my head and listened intently. I quickly realized it wasn't a wild animal. It was undeniably a person. Just as they reached the front door, the wood stove suddenly seemed 1,000 times louder, making it impossible to listen closely to whoever the hell was outside. Then they knocked, and they called out a name that made my whole world stop. My dad's name. A profound shock gripped me, forcing me to stand up and walk up to the other side of the door. How did he know my dad? Unable to resist, I called out, asking who he was. The man outside paused. I think after hearing my voice, he knew I wasn't my father. "I'm an old friend of the man who built this cabin," the unknown man said. "Was hoping I'd get to see him again." I moved a little closer to the door, feeling an overwhelming urge to open it, to finally have someone to talk to about my dad, to hear stories. But a chilling apprehension held me back. Why was he even here? I asked. The man replied that he lived in that old, abandoned town. After a moment of deliberation, I decided to share the truth. I was the son of the man he was looking for, and my dad had passed away. The man behind the door paused again. "I'm real sorry to hear that, kid. Wish I could have seen him one more time." Initially, the sentiment felt nice, but I quickly sensed something deeply off about his delivery. Something in his voice wasn't the sadness I'd expect from someone who just lost a friend. Before I could say anything, and almost as if he knew my thoughts were racing, the man continued, "Why don't you open up and we can have a chat? It's real cold out here, son. Would be nice to share that fire." Though he spoke slowly, I sensed an urgency, a lack of patience, in his tone. Something inside me screamed that he was lying, that he wasn't who he claimed to be. Sure, he knew my dad's name and was in the town, but how did I know he was truly a friend? I paused, unable to find the words to say next. In that silence, the man asked again for me to open up. He knocked on the door again, slightly harsher this time. His voice grew less kind and more demanding. I took a few steps back from the door. "Kid, open the door. You gonna let me die out here in the cold? That what your father would want from you?" My heart began pounding. I frantically dug into my backpack for my hunting knife. The man outside continued hitting the door and yelling subtle threats, completely discarding the fake identity of a harmless, kind friend. This went on for what felt like an eternity, a continuous, mounting nightmare. But then, the man punched the door in frustration, and the sound was followed by the rapid crunch of his footsteps walking away, retreating back into the woods. I stayed up all night, mind racing in fear. When the sun finally rose, and with no further signs of him, I hurriedly packed my bag and ran from the cabin. I got incredibly lucky, finding my car untouched, still hidden behind the crumbling gas station. I fled the town and drove nonstop back home. I had hoped that trip would bring me peace or closure. Instead, I was left with more questions. I realized I never truly knew why my dad moved away from there. I'd always assumed it was because the town was dying, but now I suspect there was a deeper reason he never brought me back to his cabin. I don't know why that man was still around or what he truly wanted from me, but something tells me his intentions that night were horrific. Had I allowed my emotions to guide me and open that door, I genuinely don't believe I ever would have made it out of that town. 3. The broken lock. The year was 2014. I was taking a gap year from college, traveling across the U.S. out of my car. When I reached the East Coast, my cousin generously offered me a place to stay. His cabin just south of the Appalachian Mountains. I readily accepted, eager for a break from sleeping in the car. The cabin was beautiful, more like a modern vacation home than a rustic log cabin usually found deep in the forest. I was honestly surprised my cousin let me stay there for free. As I began moving my gear from the car into the cabin, I went back out for a final load and noticed someone watching me. The person was standing out near the tree line, quite far from the path. With nothing else but me and the house in their view, they had to be watching me. Maybe they weren't trying to be creepy, I thought. I didn't know the area. For all I knew, there could have been other cabins and houses just past the trees. I grabbed the rest of my bags, locked the car, and brought the last items inside. As I closed the door, I saw the man was still standing out there, his attention clearly focused on the cabin. I immediately texted my cousin to let him know I'd arrived safely, but I also mentioned the person watching me, asking if he knew who it might be. I forgot to check his reply for almost an hour, well after the sun had set. When I finally read it, my cousin said the cabin sat on 40 acres of his private property, surrounded by a perimeter fence. Nobody else should have been out there. That instantly made me feel infinitely worse about what I had seen. Before, it was a nuisance. Now it was a serious intrusion. I went and looked outside again, but beyond the light spilling from the cabin, it was absolute pitch black. I couldn't even make out the tree line, just total darkness all around. A deep chill ran through me as I quickly closed the curtains. I tried to relax by watching a movie in the bedroom. The distraction helped, but the sense of unease was still strong. About an hour into the film, I saw a subtle movement in the corner of my eye. I snapped my head up, focusing on the window where a small gap remained in the curtains. I thought I'd seen something shift outside, but all I could see now was my own blurry reflection and the darkness behind it. I quickly got up and started walking toward the window when I suddenly heard the distinct sound of footsteps sprinting through the grass. By the time I was looking out the glass, I couldn't see anything, only faintly hearing the footsteps fading further into the dark woods. I immediately called my cousin. I'm not sure why I didn't go straight to the police, but my cousin told me to call 911 right away, so I hung up and had the cops on the line within a minute. Considering how far out the cabin was, the officer made it there in a decent amount of time. However, the man who had been watching me was long gone, and we both quickly realized there wasn't much the officer could do. He couldn't search the deep woods or really take any action unless the guy showed up again and hung around. So I was left alone once more. I honestly couldn't shake the uneasy, watched feeling for the entire rest of the night. I considered leaving, but the thought of hauling all my possessions back and forth to the car, in the middle of the dark night, felt more unsettling than just hunkering down inside. I couldn't help but look out the windows over and over, even though I knew I couldn't see anything at all. For the last hour before bed, it must have been midnight or 1 a.m., I was pacing the house, double-checking every lock, trying desperately to feel safe enough to sleep. I was just pushing off the inevitable, but I finally had to rest. I turned off all the lights in the cabin, headed to the bedroom, and locked myself in. I hoped the worst was over and got into bed, eventually falling asleep 30 minutes later. I woke up extremely early, far too early for it to be light. The sun hadn't even risen yet. It must have been around 4 a.m. This meant I had only slept for a few hours. Almost immediately, my mind snapped back into that panic state, driven by the urge to check the cabin again. There was no way I could go back to sleep without walking around first to confirm my safety. I got up, turned on the hallway light, and just listened for a second. I heard nothing but the heavy wind hitting the thin windows of the cabin. I started walking, but only made it halfway down the hall before hearing something else. It sounded like a couple of thumps coming from the far end of the cabin, where the small library room and the kitchen were located. I crept closer, and through the light spilling from the hallway, I could see the shadow of something moving near the end. I froze, desperate not to believe the terrifying situation I was in. The shadow suddenly stopped moving. After a few seconds, it slowly started moving again before a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Just from the shape of the figure, I knew it was the same guy who had been watching me earlier, the one I saw out in the trees. I spun around and locked myself back in the bedroom. The ensuing silence was deafening. I expected him to chase me, to attack, or even to break down the door, but there was nothing, just silence. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. Then, a few slow footsteps moved down the hall, coming right up to the other side of the door, and the man just stood there. I clenched my phone, wanting to call for help, but fearing he might hear me and decide to speed up whatever horrors he had planned. Instead, I made the sporadic, desperate decision to grab my keys, wrench open the window, and make a run for my car. I got in and sped away from the cabin as fast as the road would allow. When the police arrived later, they found nobody. The man had entered the cabin through a window on the far end that had a broken lock. Whether he broke it himself or it was already damaged is undetermined. Crucially, the police also found the bedroom door open. The lock on it was just a standard pushpin mechanism, easily defeated. Regardless, that meant the man was prepared to open the door and was going to do so at any minute. Had I tried to stay in the room and wait for the police, I wouldn't have gotten out so easily. What's truly unnerving is that he was there from the moment I arrived, which strongly suggests he had been watching the place for a while, perhaps waiting for me or any unsuspecting person to show up. What he truly intended, I luckily didn't have to find out.